Hello, my name is Tony Suttle. I'm a member of the Hugh Lane Gallery's panel of guides, artists and lecturers. Today's short talk for about half an hour or so will be about the Australian painter Sidney Nolan and one of his works, a painting titled Kelly at the River, which is in the gallery's permanent collection. Now, in normal times, these talks are coffee conversations are held in the gallery itself every Wednesday and are followed by a cup of tea or coffee and a chat among the attendees about the work discussed in the talk. So whenever and wherever you're watching this talk on Sidney Nolan, possibly today in Dublin or later and elsewhere, I hope you will do so in a conversational frame of mind and consider some of the points I hope to raise over the next half an hour or so, with a view perhaps to possibly accepting or disagreeing with some of the things I might say, and making up your own mind about what you think and feel about Sidney Nolan and how and what he painted. But before we look at Nolan's life, career, and some of his other works, let's first have a good look at the painting which we are fortunate enough to have in this gallery's collection. Now, this work was presented to the gallery in 1984 by the Friends of the National Collections of Ireland, about 20 years after it was painted, relatively early in Nolan's career as a full-time artist, as he developed a global reputation as perhaps currently one of the best-known artists from Australia. While loosely modernist in approach, the painting is nonetheless fully representational and shows a smallish human figure wearing an armored covering on his head, standing in an overwhelming landscape before the smouldering ruins of a small house or cottage, his head bowed. The title, Kelly at the River, tells us that this is one of the many works that Nolan and many other artists in many fields made, inspired by the story of Ned Kelly, a rebellious bushranger or outlaw who had a short but notable career in Australia in the mid-19th century. The human elements in the foreground of the painting occupy a relatively small part of the work, unless the viewer is aware of the full details of Kelly's career as an outlaw. There is some ambiguity about the stance of the human figure. As the gallery's catalogue suggests, is the Kelly figure, with head bowed, remorseful for his wrongdoings? Or is he grieving perhaps for friends or family who may have once lived in the now smouldering ruins? Or is he considering revenge on whoever caused the situation? Whatever about the human elements in the work, what is more striking perhaps is the monumentality and uniqueness of the landscape behind the human scene. As the title suggests, a river flows through a dry, desolate area, and behind loom large, seemingly rocky mountains under a blue sky with some occasional wispy clouds or perhaps heat mist above them. As usual, I ask each of you looking at this work with me, as I ask myself, do you like the painting? Does it touch you in any way, either aesthetically or something pleasing to look at, or emotionally or intellectually? Do you feel you know something new or more insightful about Australia and its history, or about mankind in general? Or, if you were looking at it on a real visit to the Hugh Lane, would you move on rapidly to the next work on the wall? While you ponder these questions, I will now move on to talk for a while about the development of art in Australia and some of the factors that may have contributed to how Sidney Nolan came to paint this work in this way. So firstly, however, let's look briefly at the timeline of his life. Nolan was born in Melbourne. His father was a tram driver, and both parents were of fifth-generation Irish descent. His grandfather had been a policeman and apparently liked to tell the young Sidney stories about Australia's early history, including those of the outlaw Ned Kelly. During his teens, Nolan had some basic art and design training at a local technical college, and age 16, he started work for 6 years with a commercial advertising and display firm in Melbourne. During that time, he also attended occasional classes at the National Gallery of Victoria Art School in Melbourne. In 1938, he married his first wife, Elizabeth Patterson, a graphic designer. This marriage ended relatively soon, largely due to Nolan's involvement over the next period of his life with a group gathered around of art patrons, John Reed and his wife, Sunday, with whom Nolan had a long and complex relationship. These two art patrons gathered around themselves a group of writers and artists referred to as the Heide or Heide Circle, after the name of their home on the outskirts of Melbourne, now a museum of modern art. The Reeds and their group had a significant influence on the personal and artistic development of both Nolan and others in the group. In the early 1950s, Nolan moved to London and spent a large part of the second half of his life there, however, also always traveling widely, spending periods of time in Greece and in the USA and in Paris, where he spent 2 years learning engraving and lithography. However, he returned frequently to Australia and continued throughout his career to draw on its history, its stories, and most particularly on the light and the landscape of Australia for his work. Now, before we look at the development of Sidney Nolan's work, let's look briefly at the overall story of art in Australia. I don't feel I can look at any aspect of Australia's history or any field of its culture without having some interest in the complexities of its two overlapping stories. The Indigenous population has been in Australia for something like 80,000 years, the Western, largely European population for only 300 or 400 years. So I think it's reasonable to say that it's only in the last 20 to 30 odd years that official policy in Australia has made significant steps to pay appropriate respect and attention to the rights and cultures of the Indigenous Australian peoples. Despite the guidance of one of my daughters, who's been living in Australia for most of her adult life, I find it difficult to give a short outline of this culture. The Indigenous Australian culture is complex to describe briefly. It has, after all, been evolving for a very long time. These are two images of the type of work I am discussing, both by Indigenous Australian artists. The lower one, by William Sandy, is done in traditional natural pigments, the other above by Rover Thomas in acrylic. You will notice that in the case of both artists, they are using their westernized or Christian names, indicative of the state policies used in efforts to assimilate the Indigenous population. However, despite its longevity, the Indigenous culture in its various forms is also in some ways somewhat fragile and ephemeral. Much of it is based on oral tradition, sometimes referred to as dream time or dreaming, which through the over 300 or more tribal or familial groupings and their distinct languages has passed on group wisdom and origin stories from generation to generation. This occurred in a somewhat itinerant, sometimes more settled, survival lifestyle in a harsh natural environment. These dreamtime related stories are often connected to where food and water might be found at different times and what other neighboring groupings might be friendly or otherwise. The Euro-oriented understanding of dreamtime is now being revised and is increasingly seen not merely as a complex and sophisticated mix of storytelling, our folk wisdom, and graphic art traditions. Rather, it is being understood as a more holistic and long-evolved combination of spiritual and practical lifestyle philosophies. Much of this information was considered highly secret and to be kept within the family or language grouping. It was often passed on through formal gatherings and initiation rites, and their associated body and ground painting, dances, and songs. Related to such ceremonies, cave and rock paintings are also to be found throughout Australia, often acting originally as markers, or if you like in today's terms, a form of road sign or warning notice, giving information on what to look out for in a given area. Now, while some early European settlers in Australia noted these cultural activities and markings, it was often largely in a sociologically or somewhat scientific context. In about the 1970s, initiated by a teacher, Geoffrey Barden, in an appropriately named area called Utopia, Indigenous painters were encouraged to present their work in a more permanent way, using initially acrylic paint and canvas. Barden's initial objective was to try and preserve Indigenous Australian culture amongst a very marginalised and disadvantaged section of Australian society. Although the inner meaning and significance of such works were, I suggest, not generally fully understood by the average Western European viewer, these works have become very popular on a global basis. I feel they are often viewed incorrectly in a similar way to contemporary Western abstract painting. These forms of Indigenous Australian art have now created a significant art world of their own. The upper painting by Rover Thomas is made of natural pigments. Rover Thomas was born in the Great Sandy Desert area, Australia, and when he was aged 10, walked 500 miles with his family to the Kimberley area and subsequently underwent traditional tribal initiation ceremonies and later became a stockman or cattle drover for a period. He began to paint in the 1970s, and his work combines the spirituality of the dreaming traditions and his affinity with both the land and his observation of it and awareness of historical events in a given area. Possibly this work represents to Western viewers a universally appealing appearance of sophisticated modernist abstraction. Now, I understand that this work by Rover Thomas recalls an event in the 1920s where a large number of Indigenous people were murdered, possibly in the context of a land clearance dispute. Widely collected, Rover Thomas's work represented Australia in the 1990 Venice Biennale. He also had a major retrospective exhibition in the New South Wales Gallery in Sydney in 2004, which I was fortunate enough to be able to visit. The lower work by William Sandy is more directly related to one of the seasonal sacred ceremonies, possibly connected with the food supply. As you can see, excuse me, I have derived both of these images from two of the many commercial galleries dealing in Indigenous Australian art. So now I hope you will forgive me for indulging myself for a few moments in showing a third and final example of Indigenous Australian art, a very large work by a female artist, Emily Kwingari. Now I'm fortunate enough in having been able to see this work in the State Art Gallery in Victoria in Melbourne some years ago. It had a strong impact on me and has become one of those works that has just stayed in my head together for me with the Mona Lisa, Guernica, and some of Francis Bacon and Clement Freud's large nude figures that I have seen also over the years. Titled Big Yam Dreaming, this work relates to a major factor in Emily's tribal or familial groupings traditional diet and is typical of much of her work. Her work achieved international success. She too represented Australia at the Venice Biennale, and she has in fact been compared to de Kooning, Bridget Riley, and even Claude Monet. Kwingari took up painting just before reaching the age of 80, and in her career, which only lasted for about 8 years, painted about 3,000 to 4,000 works, using traditional motifs based largely on the food supply traditions and body painting designs of her tribal or familial or language group. She developed her own strongly individual style, frequently changing and developing. She moved from her initial batik works to oil and acrylic on canvas. Despite her success and the large prices her work achieved, she remained on an Indigenous settlement in the Utopia area, about 250 kilometers from Alice Springs, largely supporting the rest of her extended family. So let me end this short introduction of Australia's Indigenous art by commenting that art, oral and graphic, is central to this culture. Art is a means by which the present is connected with the past and human beings with the supernatural world. So now, moving perhaps to more familiar territory, we will look at the other, more recent strand of Australian history, which consisted until relatively recently of a process of largely British colonisation. The first landings in Australia in the 1600s were by Dutch and Spanish explorers. However, it was the British, following initial mapping by Captain James Cook, who established the colonial starting points of what became today's Australia, initially used as a penal colony established near what is today's Sydney. This image of Government House in Sydney in the early to mid 1800s is typical of much of early colonial art, not only in Australia, but in other British colonial colonies as well. It has been suggested that the role of paintings such as this, produced by many colonial artists at this time, was to reflect the role and effectiveness of British colonial expansion and the spread of British civilization in far-flung and exotic locations. Excuse me. This can be seen in the orderly nature of the architecture, albeit set in unfamiliar types of vegetation and landscape. Part of the objective of such painting was to encourage others to move to Australia. The artist of this work, George Edward Peacock, was born in Sedbergh, Yorkshire, the son of a clergyman, qualified as a solicitor and married. However, having set up his own practice, he embezzled a relatively large sum of money, just over £7,000, and was condemned to death. His sentence was commuted to transportation for life, and he was sent to Australia, where his wife and children followed. There, he quickly obtained administrative posts, ending up as a meteorologist. Largely self-taught as a painter, possibly started as a means of recording weather conditions, he provides a useful record of the appearance of Australia in the early days of its establishment, emerging from its initial role as a penal colony. Now, this painting, excuse me, A Quiet Day in Darabin Creek, is by a well-loved Australian artist, Tom Robbins. Born in England with his parents, Robert emigrated to Australia in 1869. Initially, he worked in Melbourne as a photographer's assistant and studied art at night school. He returned to England and studied full-time at the Royal Academy Schools in London for 3 years. On returning to Australia, he became a full-time artist, but also supplemented his income by frame making. He worked both in landscape and portraits. And in Australia, he is best known and liked for one picture in particular, Shearing the Rams, a large work showing a classic Australian scene, which holds a similar place perhaps in Australian art history as some of Sean Keating's paintings might do in Ireland. At the time, Robert's work was not well received by some critics for not offering a sense of high art as seen by the Victorian sensibility. In general, at that time, Australian artists were ignored by the London-based artistic establishment. Personally, for me, I like it as a painting, but notably in its sense of light, it's still somewhat in the tradition of English landscape painting. It could almost be the Lake District. This next landscape is a relatively large painting by Sidney Nolan at about the middle of his career. And as you can see, he brings a more contemporary feeling and sensibility to the harshness, both of light and of vegetation of the Australian outback. For me, this work illustrates his combining the observational representation of what is before him and a strong sense of the atmosphere and mood of this unforgiving, dry, and heat-suffused place. So now let's look at the man himself and his interest in Ireland, its culture, and his visits here. And in that context, how I met his work and developed my interest in both the man and his paintings. As I said earlier, Nolan came via both of his parents of 5th generation Irish-Australian stock. He traced his family roots to the village of Ballyvaughan in County Galway, close to the Burren. He visited Ireland on a number of occasions, including visits to coincide with major exhibitions of his work. His first visit, including a trip to Ballyvaughan, was in 1971. The Australian ambassador at the time was Keith Gabriel Brennan. Brennan helped establish a chair of Australian history at University College Dublin, and then also, having met Nolan, championed support for a retrospective exhibition of Nolan's work. This exhibition was mounted in 1973, and the venue selected the Royal Dublin Society, of the RDS, in Paul's Bridge gave Nolan a vast exhibition space where it was possible to show his particular interests of the time. These included a vast triptych of murals, one in particular titled Snake, and consisting of hundreds of smallish, freestanding but connected panels, took up all of one side of the RDS's main hull and was a homage to the indigenous Australian civilization on a truly vast scale. Now, at that time, I was in my early to mid-30s and developing my interest in looking at art. Needless to say, I was blown away by the scale, the range, and the impact of what I saw at the RDS. Now, to divert for a moment, I had thought, as I first looked at Snake over 30 years ago in the RDS, that it would eventually be sold off, probably as individual panels. However, I was delighted and surprised a couple of years ago when, brought by my daughter to Hobart in Tasmania and its extraordinary MONA, or Museum of New and Old Art, I found Snake on permanent display there in a huge, specially created underground gallery. Now, this is another image of Ned Kelly by Nolan, possibly inspired by the stories told to him in his childhood by his grandfather, and possibly due to his Irish family heritage. Nolan remained interested in the Ned Kelly legend and returned to it throughout his career. The story of Ned Kelly holds a particular position in the early history of Australia and the emergence of what might be described as elements of Australia's self-image. Kelly was born in what was then the British colony of Victoria in the mid-1850s, roughly contemporary with the famines in Ireland. His father, a transported convict, died while serving a prison sentence, leaving Ned, aged 12, as the oldest male in the family. Ned and his family, as poor Irish, saw themselves as victims of a society run by an emerging British style class system, the squattocracy, and particularly as being victimized by the police. Soon, Ned, some of his brothers and other associates had formed a succession of gangs and soon ran foul of the police. In one particular altercation, a policeman was shot dead and Kelly's mother was imprisoned. Vowing to avenge his mother, Kelly and what was now known as the Kelly Gang took to the bush, becoming full-time bush rangers or outlaws. They eluded capture for about 2 years, robbing banks and the wealthy, and in the process, some further policemen were killed. Part of the Kelly Gang's temporary success was due to a level of popular support from a network of sympathizers. They were seen as having somewhat of a Robin Hood attitude and as anti-establishment. A personality sometimes referred to in Australia as larrikins, a sort of lovable rogue. Eventually, they were caught following a violent gun battle with the police, of which Kelly himself, dressed in his homemade metal armor, was the only survivor from the gang. In his defense, he set out the reasons for his having taken a life of crime and denounced the police, the government of Victoria, and the British Empire. He demanded justice for his family and for the rural poor in general. He had wide popular support, but despite large rallies and a petition for reprieve, he was sentenced and hanged at Melbourne jail. His last words were reported to have been, "Such is life." Kelly continues to be a contentious figure in Australian history. Some condemn him as a common criminal and a murderer or policeman, while others celebrate him as a folk hero and a typical example of the Australian larrikin. This work was painted by Nolan during his time at Haida with the Reeds and gifted to the National Gallery of Australia by Sunday Reed in 1977. It was part of an exhibition of Nolan's work at Dublin's IMA at the end of 2012 to early 2013. Now, throughout his career, Nolan worked in all genres of painting, including an ongoing interest in both portraiture and self-portraiture. In 1986, Nolan announced that he would donate one work from each year of his working life as an artist to the Irish people, to aid the cause for the creation of an Irish Museum of Modern Art. In the end, this exhibition never happened, or this gift never occurred. However, He did donate 6 works painted in 1989 from a planned series called The Wild Geese. These were inspired by Irish soldiers who fled the country after the failed Jacobite wars of the 1690s. He chose to represent the wild geese as well-known latter-day exiles, as well as the original ones, and wanderers such as James Joyce and Ernest Shackleton. These works were included at IMA, the Irish Museum of Modern Art's opening exhibition in 1991, which Nolan attended. And as you can see, this example is that of James Joyce. In fact, Nolan had a lifelong interest in literature and both illustrated books and provided book cover designs for over 70 publications. As with many artists throughout his career, Nolan made many self-portraits, and it's possible to suggest that his Ned Kelly series could be seen as part of his self-portraiture as a rebellious outsider. This self-portrait made about 4 years before his death, and using an element of spray paint, a medium which he would have used early in his career working in advertising. In this work, I suggest he is serious, but also showing a sense of humor and perhaps some self-mockery, which I always find reassuring in any artist, and chuckling perhaps not only at himself, but also at one of his best-known series in putting a Ned Kelly-style headpiece around himself, dressed neatly in spectacles, shirt and tie. So now, having looked briefly at Sidney Nolan, his life and development as an artist, let's return to the painting with which we started. Have your attitudes towards it changed for the better or otherwise? To me, it continues to be a most enjoyable painting, having been fortunate enough to have visited Australia several times and to have very briefly visited some parts of the outback, and having enjoyed the company of quite a few Australian people, mostly, I must admit, of European backgrounds, I feel I can appreciate why Sidney Nolan continues to have such a significant standing, not only in Australia, but globally. So working within the long Western tradition of painting, he, I suggest, has helped create a specifically Australian way of looking at and beginning to understand what Australia actually looks like, feels like, and can be experienced as a place and a set of cultures of its own. In this work, I feel it is, in a small way, a classic history painting. He is showing a significant moment in Australian history, not a great battle or political moment, but a small person in a huge landscape reflecting on what has happened. And that landscape gives us a strong sense of place, where what happened has happened, that it is in Australia and nowhere else. So I will end with his own words. In fact, before that, looking at his, he ended his life in London and is buried in Highgate Cemetery in London. So, and I will end, as I said, with a quotation in his own words. Art is a dialogue between the artist inside himself and the exterior world. So I'm conscious in the 30-odd minutes we had available to talk about Sidney Nolan and his work, notably at Kelly in the River, I've had to skip fairly quickly over many aspects of his life and work. So if you're interested, you may like to do as I did as part of my research efforts, to do some Googling and have a look at the various entries for Nolan and to explore items of interest to yourself, such as the complexities of his working and emotional relationships with John and Sunday Reid, and of his work in other media than oil on canvas, notably of his final works, and of course on the websites such as the Tate Gallery and the galleries of Melbourne and Sydney in Australia, and needless to say, of Hugh Lane itself, to see what they have to say. So on that note, I will leave you to today. Thank you for joining me for the last half an hour or so. I hope you've enjoyed it. Goodbye.